Okay, we're going to get started as folks are dialing in. So excited to be here with all of you. This is our first webinar of the semester at the Rutgers Center for Women of Business. I am Lisa Kaplowitz, and I am joined here by Deepa Purushothaman, who I want to brag about her a little bit before I even let her say hello. She is a former senior executive and corporate inclusion visionary. She challenges and redefines the status quo of leadership, success, and power by centering the experiences of women of color. She was a senior partner at Deloitte for over 20 years. She was a managing partner of their women's initiative, and she was the first Indian American woman and one of the youngest people of color to ever make partner in the history of the firm. She is an executive fellow of Harvard Business School, a proud board member of the Rutgers Center for Women in Business, and she is a renowned TED and South by Southwest speaker, has been featured in Time, PBS, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Financial Times. I had to read all these because there were too many. And Harvard Business Review. She has degrees from Wellesley, the Harvard Kennedy School, London School of Economics, and lives in LA with her husband and four fur kids. So welcome, Deepa. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Awesome. And one more title I can add after we found each other is in addition to colleague, I can say friends. So I'm happy to have you in my personal network as well. Today, we are going to talk about her book, which the first, the few, the only, how women of color can redefine power in corporate America. I didn't even know if you can see this, but when I read this, I had pages and pages of notes myself. It was the first book I personally read that talked about women of color, not as a monolith. And I thought that was really incredible. And we're going to get into that. But before we get in, we want to hear from you. So to help ground us, would love for you to click on the QR code or join us by text or the web. And I think we're going to put it in the chat as well, if that's easier. Okay, I'm going to flip the page. So on this call, have you ever personally been a first, a few, or the only? Have you been a first, a few, or an only? Okay, it looks like literally everyone on the call.
Okay.
So, Deepa, I think this is going to resonate with folks.
Okay.
Really well. Okay, so now here's our next trick. I want you all, and you can answer more than once. How did that make you feel? How is that making you feel if it's the current situation? It's telling me that responses are coming in. It makes me feel alone, lonely, scared. Lonely is pretty big. Intimidated, anxious. I love these word clouds. I think they're so cool. Look at that. We have
I've never seen it real time happen like that. It's very cool.
It's very cool, right? So we see it. And then what really pops out, Deepa, as you're looking through this, is any of this surprising?
Not, I'm still reading. No, I mean, so like the initial ones, no, not at all. I'm curious to see as like more people respond, like, are there any words that will come up that will be different? Yeah, let's see. Uncomfortable. Okay, I don't hear that. I mean, I think that's true, but I don't hear that word said often. Sad. That's not a word that comes up often, although true, right? Like the word isn't used.
Well, I love this, Deepa. Brave, proud. Those have as much visibility as the alone, challenged, intimidated. I haven't seen that as much. I don't know if you've heard that in your research and your work, but I love the positivity.
Absolutely. I think those are the two sides, right? I think it's a challenging situation to find yourself in, and the only way to get through is to kind of break through and be proud and to kind of show up authentically and to do it differently. That's actually the way to survive it. So it doesn't surprise me, especially if we have a lot of first few and onlys, but it takes a while to get to that place. So.
Right. Well, we're going to dive into all of that. Thank you all for grounding us as to where you are. Lonely is the biggest one. And I know you and I wrote about that.
Yeah.
And you wrote about that exclusively and extensively in your book. Talk to me about your personal experience. How has being a first shaped you in your own work experience and your journey?
Yeah, and just a little bit of history. So I went through grad school, and my background was politics and policy. That's actually what I went to school for. So I thought I'm going to do a year or two of private sector experience just to kind of have that credential, see what it's like. And then I'm going to go back. And I recruited out of grad school to Deloitte and ended up spending over 21 years there. So I never went back to it. I had a really great experience. I think for me, the challenge or the things that came up were later in my career, and they were more related to age than they actually were at the time, race and gender. So I was younger than everybody else, it felt like. When I was managing teams and had to give feedback, right? It was always challenging to give feedback to people that were older than me, and would they, how would they take it? How do I do it? When I would meet with clients, right? Clients would always question my authority or my experience. Like, you can't be the one in charge. And so that's how it really showed up. And so when I looked around, there weren't a lot of partners, right, that looked like me, senior leaders that looked like me, both on television, to be super clear. So not just in the firm, but in the world, right. And then also around me in the work that I did. And so I ended up having to find a voice and a style and a way of leading that was my own. And what I found was, like, there wasn't one model. So I would take bits and parts from different leaders. And I had to learn this a hard way, and then kind of make my own style and interpret in my own way. And I'll give you a really great example is, like, when I was up for a partner, one of the things you have to do as a partner is sell. I couldn't sell in the same way that a lot of my male partners did, right? Like, I couldn't take people to drinks and, wine and dine. Like, that experience was really uncomfortable as a young woman who was single. So I had to find a different style. Like, let me try breakfast meetings. Let me try family outings. Let me try something different. And so it's a great example of, this isn't just a race or gender issue. This is also just, how do you find a way to succeed, right? In a way that is authentic and unique to you. And I think for those of us that are first few and onlys, we don't have role models who've done that. So we kind of have to, like, bumble around. I mean, you've had the same experience and figure it out yourself. So.
Right. I know that's so challenging. And we've talked about this a lot, is I had very similar experiences, and we both look young on top of when we were really young, which just compounded all of that, especially in industries where, they were comprised mostly of men and white men at that. And I also love the example of there's a study, I think, of this Black woman going in to talk to a bunch of engineers, and she's getting mentored by this man. And he says, well, you just go in and you own the room and you tell them how it is. And she said, I can't do that.
Yeah,
that's not going to resonate with these guys. Yeah. And so I think that's really astute, that we have to find our whole authentic style, but we also know the bumps and challenges when we're trying to piece everything together. They don't fit in the puzzle of us the way that we think they're going to originally. So we have to define it ourselves.
Absolutely.
You write that the structure of corporate America wasn't built for us or by us. What does that mean for women of color trying to navigate their careers?
Yeah, I came to that language, and I think, a lot of us use it now after a conversation I had with Renee Myers, and she just recently left. She used to be the chief inclusion officer, the leader of inclusion at Netflix, and she's a good friend. And when I sat down to interview her, and she's like renowned for inclusion, right? I thought we would talk about inclusion. She said, Deepa, I want to talk about the airplane, right? And she said, when I was a young mom, I would get on airplanes and I would often put my luggage overhead and then spend the entire flight wondering, worrying, like, during turbulence, is the luggage going to fall on my child? Like, what's wrong? Like, why is it, designed that way? It doesn't make any sense. I would never do that. And I jumped in right away, because I explained to her, I used to travel all the time, 3 cities a week as a consultant, and I'm 5'1". So on top of, looking young and being a woman of color, I'm also little, which is also another issue. Like, when you're trying to be a leader, like, people just assume if you're smaller, right, you don't have that presence. And so I often have to stand on seats. I often get to, as soon as I board a plane, like, why did I pack so much? Like, why did I wear these shoes? All the things I did wrong. We had this really profound conversation, because she's taller, so she had never thought about that. Here we are, 2 women of color talking about this very small space that we both feel like isn't designed for us. And it's an example, or it can be used as an analogy for how other spaces aren't designed for everybody in mind. And when I went and did research, only 2 to 3% of airplane designers were women. Were women. Sorry. So yeah, and not hardly any women of color, right? So we weren't in the design seats. And so some of the things we would think about, right, as moms or as women or as people that are maybe more height challenged, didn't go into that design practice. And so the same thing is true of workplaces. Like workplaces weren't designed with us in mind because we weren't there in the seats, right, when this was all being thought about. And in a lot of ways, what we've done is we've added women, we've added mothers, we've added women of color, people of color, and just kind of said, it works wonderfully. And you kind of adjust and, conform to those around you, and you'll rise if you work hard. And I think part of the message is it's not working for a lot of us. And we saw that coming out of COVID, but especially for women of color who, to your point, have their credibility undermined, get extra work. And we'll talk about all these things, right? Don't have role models. Like, it's even more challenging. So I just think that's part of it wasn't designed for us, wasn't made for us. And we're not in the power seat. So we're not often able to adapt it in the ways that would work for us. And that's the conversation I feel like we're having.
Right. I remember reading that, and it hit me so hard because it was so visible of an example. I think the thing I've seen recently, and what gives me a lot of concern, is the AI and how this AI is getting created and how the AI is educating itself. So I don't know if you saw, there was something going around a few weeks ago where people were putting in, and it's the graphics, right? People make me look more professional. Did you see this, where the Asian woman put herself in and it made her white?
Yeah, I didn't see that one, but I saw one where it said something like, show me a leader in various countries. And in almost every single country, other than maybe Japan and India, and those were men, they were all white men, like in every single, country. And so, like, how does that even make sense? And so in this day and age, that's what AI is doing.
Right. So I know that gives me a tremendous pause as well. I also want to say for the audience, like, feel free to, type in the chat as we're talking. Deepa and I are very good at responding to comments and whatnot. And we want to try to make this as interactive as we can. I could talk to Deepa all day long. So I want to give you all the chance as well to weigh in via the chat. So Deepa, as a result of the structures not being built for women of color, what additional roles, and this is what you alluded to a second ago, do women of color end up playing in the workplace? You had categorized them into 5 different ways in the book. And can you just share that with us?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think this actually speaks to the word cloud concept, because I think for a lot of us, we step into these roles and they can have positive or negative consequences and extra responsibility, and we don't always understand it. And so part of that chapter in the book, and then I'll unpack the roles, part of that chapter in the book was kind of saying, I want you to understand that this kind of happens to us. Some of us choose it consciously. Some of us don't choose these roles consciously. They're forced upon us, but we have choice. And there's nothing good or bad about these roles, but if we don't actively make the choice, I think a lot of women of color don't feel like they have agency in their work lives. And that's really what I'm talking about, because without agency, it's hard to have power. So a couple of them, for example, and I'm just because I call them different things sometimes when I talk, so I'm gonna actually use the titles that are in the book. So the representative, right? Like, I represent my entire race. And so I'll give you an example. There was a woman, Roxy, who I interviewed, and 45 minutes into our interview, she started crying. And I, initially wasn't sure what she was, what she was so emotional about. And she said, Deepa, I didn't realize until talking to you, like, what I've done. So she had moved to the Midwest for this amazing job opportunity. And her tears came from the fact that she realized she had moved her family too, and what she was experiencing, her children were experiencing. So she moved to the Midwest. She knew when she took the job, she was the only Black woman in the department. She came to find over her 9 months there, she was the only Black person in the entire company. And again, her children now facing the same thing, probably at school. And she said, I feel like I need to represent, air quotes, represent my race. I am the only Black person some of my white colleagues have ever met. And so I really didn't realize until talking to you how much that affects how I show up, what I eat, what I talk about, how I dress. Like, she went through this long list. And she said, I just do it because I feel like I have to. I want to make sure they have a good experience with me because I'm representing all Black people. And I've heard this story from Muslim women, from other groups. It's a real responsibility. She didn't know that she was doing that and that it was a heavy role to take on all the time. And I want to be super clear. She wasn't in HR or marketing or something where maybe that makes sense in some weird way. She was an accountant. It had nothing to do with the job she was hired to do.
Right. And
So-
Deepa, I just want to pause right there for a second, because that's like a whole nother job. And I'm a finance gal, right?
Yeah.
And so we aren't trained. We were not trained in any of that stuff. So if you're asking an accountant to take on this, that's like harder than my real job is
that's the
right
point.
now. So just exhausting,
right? And there's a whole, language around code switching, this feeling of that this is not who I am in real life, or I have to change how I talk or how I show up to kind of, fit into the, the culture or the atmosphere around me. And it's an example of that. And so we did a lot of talking about maybe that's a role you want to take on sometimes, but not every day, all the time, and you can give it back. So that's an example. And a lot of us, I think, feel like we represent, right? Being a first and only, I'm representing all the women of color behind me, all the women after me. I felt that like I wanted to leave because, and I partly left because I got really sick, but I felt like I had to sit in the seat because if I quit, what would all the other women and women of color behind me think, right? So it shows up in really profound ways for a lot of the women I interview.
Right. And Deepa, you said something that I think is really important that we need to repeat. You don't have to take on that role every day. You can give that role back. You can take it on sometimes, but you can give it back.
Yes.
It wasn't even given to you.
Important. Yeah, exactly. That you can take it, because I think this is part of what women of color are coming to talk about. And I, more freely and realize this, like there are days where I can take that on, but there are days where I can't, and it's okay. Right. And that's not my limiting issue. That's not my failure. It's too hard today. So I'm not going to take it on. And that feels like a very new dialogue to me. I haven't seen that talked about in the ways that I've seen it talked about in the last couple of years. So that's wonderful.
Yeah. And that gets to the agency.
Yeah, exactly. The next one is balloon popper. And this is what I feel like I have played in my own career. This sense of like, if you're in a room and something doesn't feel right, or something is said that's inappropriate, or, a decision isn't being made in the right way, you feel the need to, I call it balloon popping, because it's like you're popping a balloon and kind of, shocking everybody into like the reality of the situation. But a lot of women of color are forced to play that in their companies, right? In a DE&I role. So I'll give you an example. This woman who was a filmmaker said, all these, movies were being made, but they were about Black men in my company, but they weren't being made by people of color. And it just kind of all of a sudden this new project came up, and I felt the need to say, like, I think this project should be done by a person of color because there's a very unique perspective we would bring to this story. But everyone looked at me and I felt like I had to carry that weight. So the sense of like, you have to say what needs to be said, but there is backlash to that, right? So balloon popper, another one. Again, take it on when you want to, but you don't have to take it on all the time. The other one is seed sower, right? So some of us are just kind of planting seeds and getting conversations started. And this is like a simple one that comes up in a lot of corporate sort of settings of something is said in a room that's not appropriate. I'm going to kind of set the stage for, pointing out that's not really done in the right way, or I want to kind of start a new conversation. But I'm a seed sower, right? Like I'm just kind of planting seeds of what needs to happen in the future. But that's also heavy if you're having a company change direction, or again, speaking to something that's uncomfortable to talk about. The last two, one is sage, right? So for example, after George Floyd's murder, a lot of the Black women I interviewed felt like they held the bucket for everything race related, like anything that would happen. Or in some cases, if you're the only woman of color who is in a senior role, everyone in the company will come to you. I would tell you, Lisa, ever since the book has come out, I get easily hundreds of messages every week. Like, can I just have 30 minutes to chat with you? There's no one in my company or my industry that I feel like I can talk to about this topic. But if you're in a company and you're supporting all of the women of color in your company, that's a whole extra role that you don't get paid for or don't get acknowledged. It's a lot. And so this sort of sage role, again, take it on when you want, but it's probably not possible for you to take it on all the time. And then the last one, right, is just the inclusion role. Like a lot of us in default end up in these inclusion roles as women or women of color. And they're not paid, they're extra work, and they're roles that we can say no to, but it's sometimes hard for us to realize we don't have to say yes all the time.
Right. I think that's really important. And in our research, and I know you've probably found it as well, is that usually women of color are finding themselves in multiple categories here. Yeah. It's not just one or the other. And again, it's a lot of work. And then a lot of times what I've heard even from some friends is that they're put in these roles, or even more from a tokenism standpoint, put on these deals, especially law firms are horrible at this, is okay, and lawyers get compensated based on origination, getting new clients, and then billable hours of your existing client. And if you're putting the woman of color on the team because the clients now have a supply chain initiative where they have to have a woman of color on the team, and then she's not getting origination credit, and then she's having to fly to all these clients, so she's not able to bill enough hours, then all of a sudden she gets put off the partner track.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a real issue. Like, I call it pink chair roles in the book, right? But there are these roles that are culture building roles that aren't supported in the same way. They don't, go into year-end review process consideration. They're not partner track, quote unquote, or executive track sort of roles, but they're roles we expect women and women of color to take on because, quote unquote, there's no one else to do it. But there is a cost of doing it. And I think it's really important to talk about that.
Yeah, that's huge. Now, you talk a lot in the book, and then we ended up doing some work on this as well. How have you seen women of color adapt? How have they had to adapt? Because you said you can't take this on all the time, but it's hard to change the system overnight.
Yeah. I think the biggest issue that I found in writing the book was this pressure that so many women of color felt to conform. There is only one track, one way to get ahead. Leadership looks a certain way. Executive presence looks a certain way, right? I used to get this feedback. You need to have more executive presence, but I didn't really know what that meant, right? I remember right? Or I had a sponsor who was really trying to be a sponsor who said to me, like, you might want to get like fake glasses and like wear more power suits, wear your hair up, just so people take you more seriously, because that's what in his mind, executive presence, right, was those things. And so this idea of conforming, and Lisa, I've shared this story with you before, like this book came out of like a series of dinners I did where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And a public company CFO, because, of your background, we've talked about this, a public company CFO, a Black woman, said, I feel like I sat in a really powerful seat, like a seat of power, and I didn't feel powerful in my role because I often edited myself, right? And so I think there's this really deep sense of I have to conform in a certain way, and it can go from everything from how I wear my hair to, again, how I show up, what I say yes to, again, because I think this is what I need to do to get ahead, and this is what's been rewarded in my company culture. So that's a big one. The other one that came up was on the word called loneliness. So many of the women that I interview are lonely. They haven't had time to make outside friendships or do other things because they feel like all eyes are on them because they're an only, right? So there's no room for failure. They have to be extra, perfect. And almost everyone that I interviewed would say, I have to work 2 times to 4 times as hard just to get to the seat because I'm a person of color. And the Black woman would say 4 times as hard, right? And they've been taught this from childhood. So that's another one, this loneliness and having to work harder. The other one is, right, that I need to fit into Rise, which we talked about in regards to conforming, but also sacrificing to succeed, right? Like I have to give up personal time, or I have to give up parts of myself if I want to get ahead. So there's a lot of these messages that I think we have internalized, and they are conscious and unconscious about what it takes to get to the top. And I think most of us are just kind of doing that because that's what's come before. And part of my work in like working with women of color in particular is I want you to understand what that costs you. I want you to understand that for a lot of us, we're sick, we're ill, we have physical manifestations of the stress that we're feeling from having to do these things because they're inauthentic to who we are. And when you don't show up in full voice or as yourself, there are ramifications as I found in my research.
Right. And then can you spend a minute talking about code switching? Because there was an analogy used in the book, and I'm white, I present white, that really resonated with me for women of color and just people of color about, a foreign country.
Yeah. So, what's really interesting is, in a little bit of a side note, I wrote the book for women of color, but it's been fascinating to see who's picked it up, right? So I've had to do a lot of conversations, especially with white men in the beginning. Like there would be a lot of the podcasters or the reporters that would, interview me, which is a whole different conversation. But they're like, I didn't really understand. Like I knew it was different for women of color, but until you're reading your book and seeing how many stories you had, I just thought those were one-off cases. No, you are like showing us, because I interviewed 500 women, like almost 500 stories of it happening over and over and over again. So yes, the sense of code switching, and what I talk about in the book is I want you to think about when you went to a different country. And I used to do business in Latin America, right? So I would often go to Latin America and have to do business in Spanish for like a whole day. Spanish is obviously not my first language. I don't speak it well. And it's a challenge. And on those days, I would run back to my hotel room and have to take a nap because literally my brain hurt from having to like do business in a different language. Have you ever like gone overseas and done business in a different language, or spent a day where like English wasn't the first language? And so there was always translation happening. Those days for most of the people that I talk to who are not women of color are harder, right? The white men I interview, they'll say, like, yeah, those days are really hard. That's what it's like for a lot of women of color to operate in their traditional business setting. Like we have to translate, we have to adapt, we have to, change how we are. And it's a form of code switching. And so that analogy just seems to resonate with people.
Yeah, I think, and for me, I studied in Spain. And so I remember coming home and being I couldn't even think.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, when I read that, that was such an aha moment, for me as well. Because it just kind of, it sunk in. And Jocelyn's talking about being a seed planter, as well in your experience there. It's really hard. Deepa, we, and you and I have talked about this before, between empower and power, right? We can only empower ourselves so much because we don't have the power yet at the table. And we're not the ones controlling the workplaces as much. So what needs to change at the workplace? Because it's not about fixing her. It's not about fixing women of color. What needs to be fixed?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because I think that's one of the fundamental challenges I see in a lot of companies I go into. A lot of the programs that exist currently, even after this big wave of inclusion in the last couple of years, is let's fix the woman, right? So let's put in a place like a confidence program, or let's, give her a coach, and that'll like fix everything. And I'm not saying that's not important, but just fixing the woman or the woman of color, right, makes it seem like there's something wrong with us. And part of this conversation that I have been trying to have, and I feel like now, again, because of COVID and other things, like I'm now part of a much larger conversation, is structurally, there's something in how we work that makes it not work for all people, right? And part of my work is making work for all. But that's really what we're getting at. So most programs focus on fixing the woman, or they'll put a metric in place, right? Let's get to, I've had so many companies that we work with say, I want to get to 30% women in, leadership, or women.
Right, because somebody out there says 30% is the salient minority, yes, and everybody's hooked on the 30%.
Yes. But Lisa, there's no plan on how you get to the 30. It's like by 2050, we're going to have, 30%. Great. What are you going to do? I don't know. Let's just make a target. We're going to make a target and it'll happen, right? So it's like these, okay, I understand. And I'm not saying targets aren't important, but they need to be in conjunction with other things. So I think the work is really in helping women of color find their agency, find their voice, find their community, because there's a lot of power in realizing you are not alone and what your experience is not unique to you. And that was, I think, my big learning. A lot of what I found myself was not Deepa. It was like, there are universal patterns and experiences. The second is we need our managers and our allies to do more in the workplace. We did a research project with Billie Jean King a few years ago. And what we found is that 91% of the white women that we interviewed said they wanted to support women of color in the workplace and be better sponsors and mentors and advocates. Only 9% were actually doing something, right? So 91 versus 9. Like we need allies and managers to do more in the day-to-day. Like most women of color leave because of something their manager has done. So it's not, yes, the CEO matters. I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's this, our feeling of belonging comes from our small interactions with our team and our managers. And so if something is said in a room or you're in a review, we say, right, Deepa's too ambitious. Why is she being so ambitious? It's upon other people to say, like, are we asking if Bob is ambitious, right? Are we asking the same questions for all people? And managers and allies need to step up. And then I think the other part is that we need leaders to realize like culture matters and tone does matter and that their actions matter. And so one of my favorite stories in the book is of the CEO of a small tech company. And after COVID, when everyone was back in the office, he said, I want to do these new product meetings on Monday mornings. And he would host these product meetings. And for the first like 6 or 8 meetings, the same 6 or 8 men, and they were all happened to be white men. I just remember him telling me they all wore baseball hats, like they all wore the same sneakers, like there was this look, and they all showed up. And no one else would come to the meetings, right? Because they just assumed these were, he was only going to listen to the small segment of the company. And by the 8th meeting, he literally walked into the room and he walked out and he said, I'm not coming back to these meetings until the room looks like the people I hire. And he started doing that in all of his meetings. Like, you're not going to get my time unless everyone who I think needs to be here is here. And it's a great example of, I think, as executives or as leaders, we don't realize what we give time to, what we condone is not just what we say and do, but it's also what we tolerate. And so he started a new behavior. And within the next 3 meetings, that entire room changed because people felt like, wow, I'm really being invited. He's going to listen to me. And so and he also, by the way, company had great ideas and did some really innovative things because of those conversations. But as leaders, we actually have to be more thoughtful, I think, about what we tolerate. So I think it's all of those things together, and it's a culture conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I feel like we've talked ad nauseum, not necessarily right here, but talked ad nauseum about the business case for diversity. I mean, you can count to tons of research about increased profitability, greater stock price appreciation, more innovation, less risk. And you look at the leaders during COVID and the skills that are required. And a lot of those skills we developed based on our lived experience as women of color. We just did some work too on caregiving and the experiences of caregiving and how those are the leadership qualities you need. And so I think what you're talking about, Deepa, in reframing also just what a leader looks like, as well. There's a question in here. I'm putting you on the spot, about the types of programs that folks are offering for people of color in corporations. So management accelerators, training programs. Can you talk a little bit about the fixing her versus, again, fixing the organization?
Yeah. And I think programs, I actually know some of the people that are doing that program. I think that's a great program. Like, I think we need to do more work to create community. So I think programs that get women of color, get people of color together and have conversations are good, because so much of this is around the loneliness. How do we combat the loneliness? Well, you put people in a room and you have conversations that you wouldn't normally have. So I do think programs like that are helpful. But what I'm saying is, a lot of companies I work with will just do that program and not necessarily feel like they have a culture problem. So you need both, right? Let's provide spaces for women of color to have transparent conversation, find community, realize they're not alone, and also maybe talk about, is presentation, is confidence different for us? And I'm not saying it is, but maybe there are things that we can learn when we share our stories, right? How we show up differently. Like, I had to learn some of those things on my own. But if that's all we're doing and we're not changing the culture, we're not changing who we think as leaders is ready, right? We're not changing our promotion tracks. We're not changing how we reward people. We're not looking at our internal policies, then just fixing the woman. I'll tell you, most of those programs end up with the women leaving, in all candor, if you look at the data. Like, we make the woman so confident, she realizes it's not her, it's the company, and she leaves. And so you need both, is I think all I'm saying.
Right. I think that makes sense. And we've started a program at the center called GAME, Generating Allyship in Male Executives, not to center the men, but to bring the men into the conversation. And part of the program is that we provide them with questions to go to a female colleague. And the learnings that they've had coming out of there, a lot of it is a lack of awareness. I mean, things that we experience every single day, right? Oh, I didn't realize the interruption she was getting. I didn't realize the ideas that were getting taken from her. Didn't realize that we weren't giving direct feedback. So you talked about feedback for a second. And there's one example. You talked about feedback for a second of, it's not actionable feedback. It's character related, where women, especially women of color, get less actionable feedback. And so the men, there was one man in particular who said, well, I'm scared. I'm scared of being accused of harassment, of whatever it is, right? And he said, okay, so let's play this through. So what's happening? So you're not giving the person feedback. Then what happened? Well, she wasn't improving. Okay, then what happened? Well, she didn't get promoted. Okay, then what happened? Well, she left. Then what happened? Well, our numbers went down.
Yeah.
And then he was like, oh. And so it seems, as you talk through it, it's so obvious, but I think having these conversations are really important, because that lack of what seems so obvious to us isn't so obvious at times.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the data suggests that Black women in particular, of all groups, get the least feedback.
Correct.
And so, yeah, they don't necessarily get the feedback to improve. And we don't also give them enough, chance to demonstrate once they get the feedback that they can improve. So like, I want to be clear because my research does, I do where I can parse out. There are differences. Not everybody is the same. But I also think you're right. Like we don't have those conversations. And part of, to me, what was so alarming is that when I looked at some of the research, it says that 70% of white Americans live in communities that look like them. So that means like if you're going to Starbucks or the grocery store, the dry cleaners, you're interacting with people who are white. And the workplace is actually one of the only places where we interact with people who are different from us. So I just want to repeat that because it's so important. The workplace is one of the only places, because you're not going to do it like in your day-to-day at your kids' like soccer game, because like, all right, we just don't happen to have communities that tend to be that diverse. And so if the workplace is one of the only places where you're interacting with, people who are different than you, you have to have these uncomfortable conversations at work or you're never going to have them. And so that's kind of the fascinating part of like all this, like, inclusion conversation. We're saying maybe it's not a workplace issue. Like that's how we came into this conversation a few years ago. And maybe I feel like sometimes going back there now, but workplace is one of the only places where adults can have these conversations. So if you don't have them here, we're never going to get better as a country.
Right. And I think it's happening earlier. I see it as my kids are in high school that they're having these conversations. But it's interesting. In my class, we did a case on Arlen Hamilton this week. She's a black queer woman who started a venture capital firm, and her
story is fascinating. Yes.
Story is fascinating. Her whole ethos resonates with the core values of Rutgers Business School: resourcefulness, reinventiveness, resiliency, and responsibility. And so we talked about it, and, in finance, you don't have these conversations a lot, and most faculty are nervous about having them. One, because they're not trained in it, and two, they want to stay away and just focus on the data. And so I'm not scared. So I had the conversation, and my class actually has a very, very small percentage of white people, coincidentally, at Rutgers. And we are one of the most diverse colleges in the country. And so I had this conversation, and, we talk about the fact that Black women aren't funded. And, there aren't, and women in general, it's a couple percentage points. And then Black women in particular, it's less than 1% of VC dollars. And the people in the VC industry, the investors, are not women and women of color as well. And so we talked about that, and they said, well, it's been proven that the white guys have had successful business models, even though, 90-something% of startups fail. And so I broke it down to them, and I said, okay, think about this. You all are finance majors. You look at the major, they want to go into investment banking. And so I said, well, the investment banks, are now starting to hire from Rutgers, but before they weren't hiring from Rutgers, and they'd hire from, these Ivy League schools. And is that right? Are those Ivy League schools more prepared than you all are? You're actually learning the analysis that you're going to do. And so finally they said, you know what? No, I was here. I could do all the stuff. There was somebody from, such and such school. They were a sociology major. And, I was able to hit the ground running. And so again, it was reframing it from a perspective where they identified with the population, and really challenging to have these conversations. If we're not having them in school and we're not having them at home, what else can we do in the workplace to make sure that we're having them? And is it too late?
Yeah. I think there's two. I think the next generation is doing this better than our generation, right? So I think for our generation, it has to happen in the workplace. But I also think, so much of this is this, and I believe it's a fallacy, and it's a core through the book, is that we believe workplaces are meritocracy, right? That is what I think, we were all, not women of color, but I feel like that's what we were all taught. If you work hard, it'll turn out okay. And I think part of what I've tried to do with my stories in the book and the research is that it's not a meritocracy, especially in corporate America. The experiences are really different. And that's why that airplane analogy is so important.
Right.
If we kind of can acknowledge that spaces show up differently for different groups, then we can take some of the emotion out of it, right? And some of the, the uncomfortableness. I'm looking at the chat and Jocelyn, right? The uncomfortableness, and just say factually, right? Spaces show up differently for different people. Right. When you say that, I talk to a lot of companies on stages. Actually, all the white men will be like, actually, that makes sense. If I tell the airplane analogy similar to what you're saying, people get it, and then they can engage in that conversation.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of people just worked harder. That's not really true for everybody. And I don't think we put ourselves in and Jocelyn is saying this, in other people's shoes enough. I don't think we start to really look at it's not the same for all people, and there are
Right.
differences, and we need to understand them.
Right, right. That being said, if any of my students are on this right now, it doesn't mean we don't work hard, because we still need to work hard. That's table stakes.
Yes.
Can we talk about power for a second? You break it down. Can you take us through the 4 new rules of power?
Yeah. So one of the things I found so fascinating when I started my research is I wanted to explore power, and I would ask women, and women in general, not just women of color, women to, talk about power, and they would all look down, look at their feet, and that's usually a sign of being uncomfortable. They didn't want to talk about power. And when I really started to unpack it, I think most of us have a really uncomfortable relationship with the concept of power. We've been taught that power is top down. Or we actually, if you look at the research in my own research, I found that there's basically like 10 or 12 books that most of us have been, read or been taught are about power. And there are things like Machiavelli's Prince or the 48 Rules. There are these very sort of top down, assertive, very, aggressive sort of ways of power. And for a lot of the women that I interviewed, that way of power doesn't resonate with us. It's not how we want to lead. It's not how we want to live. And it's a lot of why I think a lot of us step away in really senior roles from wanting that life anymore. And we found that even, Lisa, in the piece that we did for HBR with those 5 maladaptations.
Right.
A lot of women will get to the top and realize, wait, there's some dissonance happening for me, so I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
And so, what I started to want to look at and explore is is there a different way we can see power? Because maybe if we can see it differently and realize that we can shape it in the ways that we want, we'll stay in these seats longer. Because my work is not about everyone exit corporate America. It's about, we need to kind of show up as ourselves, again, back to that, word cloud, because that way we can actually stay for longer and influence change around us. Because if we all leave, we're never going to make change. And so this idea of 4 new ways of power. So one is, I sat down with Stacey Brown Philpott. She's the former CEO of TaskRabbit, and her family had just gotten a puppy the week that I interviewed her. And she was sharing that she never wanted the puppy. This was during COVID. I didn't want the puppy, but my kids and my husband wanted the puppy. We got the puppy. She said, Deepa, I'm fascinated because this puppy, Fifi, follows me around all day. All day, it's following me around. And I didn't want it. And she said, I think it's because I'm stern and I set boundaries, but I'm also not yelling at it or screaming at it.
Right.
And we had this really interesting conversation about leadership and power. What if power is about creating safety for people to show up as they need to show up, like she was doing for that puppy? And I really think that's one of the biggest new principles around power, that power is about followership. Power is about really making people show up in their best ways at work. And that's how we should really use power. The second is that power can be used for good. A lot of women and women of color just don't want to, deal with power because it's exploitative. So let's start to reframe it, realize that power can be for good. It can be a multiplier. We can kind of do it differently. My favorite one, and I'll jump ahead and then we can come back to the last one if you want, is that power can be redone. When I would interview people, a lot of people just believe the structures and systems around them are the structures and systems around them. I can't change my company. I can't change the legal system. I can't. So you kind of just accept it. And that's not what I believe. And I come from that place. And there's a story in the book that I love. It's one of my favorite stories, is because I interviewed a lobbyist and she said, Deepa, have you ever watched a movie? And, like an olden movie, and there'll be a king and the king dies. And in the moment the king dies, everyone will say, the king is dead, long live the king. And she said, Deepa, we in that moment are giving power to the new king. We give power to institutions. We give power to the things around us. And so her message was that power can be redone. And I think for a lot of us, we don't think that power can be redone and that we have the power. It's not the institutions or the rules that have power. We actually give them power. And so those are just 3 of the 4. I think the other one was just, we need to lead with ourselves. Our power comes from inside, which is such a big theme of the book, right? Most of us think that power comes from the accolades or the degrees that we have, or, how people recognize us. But no, real power, what I found from meeting these 500 women, their real power came from knowing who they were and where they came from and their lived experience. And if they could find ways to make their work allow space for that, then they were really powerful and happy and content and really their best selves.
Right. I think that's so important. And especially the reframing it, because power for a lot of women, and from what I've heard, women of color, really has all these negative connotations because, it's thought of as toxic. It's thought of as traditionally masculine, and that's not who we are. And so we don't want anything to do with it, when in reality, that's going to be our special secret.
Yeah.
It
doesn't have to be that. I think that's the point, that we have created a narrative where we think that is power, and that's not power. that's one aspect of power. And candidly, I think that's old power, you know?
Yes, agreed. Nancy, Dr. DiTomaso had a really good question about, we touched on this actually before we even jumped on here about the DEI landscape and how any of these lawsuits are changing. And at the center, we actually just had a conversation with our employee resource group roundtable about this and how, it's affecting certain companies, DEI initiatives or the employee resource groups, the budgets, what are, we saw Fearless Fund, thank goodness they won that hearing. But what are you seeing out there in your work?
Yeah, Nancy, and I almost feel like this is a conversation that we have to kind of have more openly. So I would tell you that just in the last 2 weeks, I've had two very visible organizations come to me and say, can you kind of help us have conversations about this topic? What we're seeing is one organization supports a lot of DE&I leaders. And they said a lot of their DE&I leaders are in this organization are coming to them saying that they're scared. They're not sure what they can do. A lot of people are they've been just told to hold still. They've had their budgets cut. They've had their staff cut. They've been told we just need to kind of wait and see what happens. And so I feel like a lot of people candidly are in like a holding position, waiting to see what's going to happen with this legal, over the next few months and even with the election in all candor. And so I do feel like a lot of people are I call it holding your breath. And I think it's a really hard place to be. I think if you know any DE&I leaders, I would go hug them and like put your support around them because I think there's a lot of fear and scare, concern. I think a lot of companies, are taking their funds partly because of also the recession conversation. And this is an opportunity to pivot funds. And so I think a lot of people are taking money they'd set aside for DE&I and putting it elsewhere. But I also personally don't think we're going to go back to, not having it at all. I kind of see this work as a pendulum. And when I kind of try and coach people, we have maybe swung, to a little bit of a further place than some companies might be comfortable with. I don't think we're going to go back to where we were, but I think it's this process where we're going to settle out. And we've made too much progress. We've kind of taken the lid off of some of these conversations. So that's not going away. So I don't think we're going to regress completely, but I also just think, it's going to take some time to uncover this. And then I candidly think until we have the election, everyone's just kind of, this has turned into a political conversation more than what's right or what do we really want conversation in this moment.
Right. And adding to that, I think the data is still going to be key. Because without the data and getting access to the data, you don't know what the trends really are. And it's not necessarily, it's not even necessarily, it's not hiring someone because of what their identity is or how they look. It's making sure that we have the pipelines available and we're looking in all the places to give everyone the opportunity to have these positions. And so again, it's that reframing that conversation, I think, which is what the broader conversation, Deepa, is that you're alluding to.
Elise, and I just because I know Nancy is also a professor, I also kind of feel like there's so much that we can learn from the academic space. And you all have had this conversation, I don't want to say months ahead, but like a few months ahead of where I think companies are headed. And I do think initially there was this feeling amongst companies, well, if universities are now having to rethink their admissions policy, that's going to happen to us too. And I think we're like getting a little bit smarter about like taking a pause and seeing if that's really true and what that looks like. But I just think there's general anxiousness everywhere. So it's not just companies, but we can't just assume it's going to be the same everywhere. Maybe this is a chance to have those hard conversations and do this in a way that, gets people educated on why, to your point, Lisa, I think what you're saying is this is important. It's not that the topic is not important. But we've politicized it or we've done other things to it to make it more complicated.
Right. And what the colleges are doing and the universities are doing is looking at the lived experience you have and how your lived experience, which could be encompassing race or gender or ethnicity or socioeconomic status, has impacted your work, right? So at work, you could look at it the same way as how is it approaching problems? How is it looking at, how is it relating to the target customer that we have right now? How is that experience helpful for us as well? Again, talking about the business case, which is personally where I think this is going to end up pivoting a little bit. But I don't have any data yet to back that.
Yeah, I have to be honest. I hate the business case conversation because it feels like it's regressive, but I also think this is valuable. And I mean, at the end of the day, companies are, and again, I don't love this, but companies are all about the bottom line. And at the end of the day, if you look at the numbers in the last couple of years, we've had huge numbers of women leave. We've had huge numbers of women of color leave. I would say a year ago, I was talking to women. It was 2/3 of the women of color I was interviewing were going to leave. I would tell you in my recent conversations that number hasn't decreased, it's actually increasing. They're a little bit more fearful of leaving because of what else is out there. But I
Right.
actually think it's gotten worse in some cases, meaning wanting to leave. So I also think that
Right.
from a business perspective, they can't have all their women of color leave because the next generation is not going to allow that. So
Correct.
I think it's a little bit of a different situation.
Yeah, no, you're correct. And this whole childcare cliff, which might happen in 2 days, one day,
Yes.
also is very concerning because it hurts women and women of color even more
Yeah.
so. We are out of time, but Deepa, do you have any last thoughts that you want to leave us with before we close this out?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just bring us back to that word cloud because I think, yes, it is hard to be a woman of color in business. It can be challenging, you can be alone, but I also think it's a really special moment where we know what our unique gifts are. I think companies also need different voices in leadership. So remembering both sides of that, yes, it can be hard to navigate, but there are strengths. I don't like the word superpowers, but there are strengths and unique things we can bring, once we have that seat at the table, that it's important to use our voice. And to allies and leaders, I would just say this is a really important moment. And as much as you can do to support, people around you, what you do in some ways may even be more important than what people that look like me do, because you're the ones that are, to your point, sitting in the power seats and can make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of this, Deepa. I know I learned a lot. I do every time I see you and talk with you, which is great. Just want to thank our corporate partners as well for helping us put these things on. We wouldn't be here without you. And then just want to share with the audience a couple events that we have coming up as well. On November 9th, we have another webinar, The Power of Saying No, which I need to listen to really well as well, because that's do as I say, not as I do. And then a little before that, on November 3rd, we have a conference on hybrid and remote work, the current state and the path forward, where we're really trying to bring academics and executives together to think through what is working, what isn't, and what other research questions do we need to explore using the experiences of industry to help us do that. I just want to close out. Deepa just launched a LinkedIn course, which is phenomenal. And I think, Deepa, it's landmark because it's their first course on women of color. Do you want to direct people how to get there?
Yeah, if you just go to my LinkedIn page, everything is there. Or if you know where LinkedIn Learning, if you just Google my name or Google women of, not Google, but search on LinkedIn, women of color courses, it will show up.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Deepa. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us in our community. And no, folks, you are not alone. And you should be proud of who you are and the power you have within to contribute. So thank you. Take care, everybody.